The case of Luis Garavito, the beast that preyed on the innocent, in the mountains of Colombia, where children's laughter should echo through small villages and their footsteps should wear paths to school each morning, there lived a monster disguised as a man. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos didn't look like the nightmare he would become. He was small, soft-spoken, with gentle eyes that could fool anyone into believing he was harmless. But behind that unremarkable facade lurked something so evil that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend the scope of his crimes. Between 1992 and 1999, this man would become responsible for the deaths of over 400 children, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in human history. His victims were the most vulnerable members of society: street children, orphans, and kids from families so poor they had no voice, no protection, no one to search for them when they disappeared. Garavito called himself the teacher when he approached children, offering them small gifts, food, or the promise of work. His voice was kind, his manner patient, and his smile seemed genuine. Children trusted him because he looked like someone's grandfather, someone who might help them find their way home. They had no idea they were walking toward their death. The horror of Luis Garavito's crimes isn't just in the numbers. Though 400 murdered children is a statistic that defies comprehension, it's in the calculated way he hunted his prey, the methodical manner in which he gained their trust, and the complete absence of humanity he showed as he ended their young lives. This is the story of how one man's twisted mind created a trail of death across an entire country, and how a society failed to protect its most innocent members. But perhaps most chilling of all is how long he was able to continue his reign of terror, moving from town to town, always finding new victims, always staying one step ahead of authorities who couldn't imagine the true scope of what they were dealing with. What kind of mind could conceive such systematic evil? And how many children might still be alive today if someone had recognized the beast hiding behind that gentle smile? Luis Alfredo Garavito was born on January 25, 1957, in Genova, a small town in the coffee-growing region of Quindío, Colombia. His childhood was marked by poverty, violence, and abuse that would leave scars on his psyche for the rest of his life. But millions of children grow up in similar circumstances without becoming monsters. So what made Luis different? His father was an alcoholic who beat his children regularly, and his mother was too overwhelmed by poverty and fear to protect them. Luis was the oldest of 7 children, and from an early age he learned that the world was a place where the strong preyed upon the weak. He was sexually abused by neighbors and family friends, experiences that twisted his understanding of power and vulnerability. As a child, Luis was quiet and withdrawn, spending hours alone in the mountains around his village. He would later claim that he heard voices during these solitary walks, voices that told him he was special, that he had a mission to fulfill. Whether these voices were real or simply the beginning of his elaborate system of self-justification, they became central to how he understood himself. School was difficult for Luis. He struggled with learning and was often mocked by other children for his small stature and strange behavior. Teachers described him as a loner who seemed to live in his own world, drawing disturbing pictures and showing little interest in normal childhood activities. He was fascinated by death from an early age, collecting dead insects and small animals with an intensity that worried the adults around him. By the time he was a teenager, Luis had developed a deep resentment toward the world and everyone in it. He felt that life had been unfair to him, that he had been denied the love and protection that other children received. This sense of victimization would later become part of how he justified his crimes. In his twisted mind, he was simply passing on the pain that had been inflicted on him. His family moved frequently, always searching for better opportunities that never materialized. This constant displacement meant that Luis never formed lasting relationships or developed a sense of belonging anywhere. He learned to adapt quickly to new environments, to read people and situations, and to present whatever version of himself would be most useful in any given moment. These early experiences were shaping Luis into someone who saw other people not as individuals with their own hopes and fears, but as objects to be manipulated or destroyed. The foundation for his future crimes was being laid in these formative years, though no one around him could have imagined what he would eventually become. The first signs that Luis Garavito was becoming something dangerous appeared when he was in his early 20s. He had left his family's home and was drifting from town to town, taking odd jobs and never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections with other people. But during this period, he began to develop the skills and methods that would later make him such an effective predator. Luis discovered that he had a natural talent for gaining people's trust. His small stature and soft-spoken manner made him seem harmless, even helpful. He learned to read people quickly, to identify their vulnerabilities and desires, and to present himself as exactly what they needed. With adults, he was respectful and hard-working. With children, he was kind and generous, always carrying small gifts or treats. It was during this time that Luis began to focus specifically on children as objects of his attention. He would later claim that he felt a special connection to them because of his own traumatic childhood. But the truth was more sinister. Children were easier to manipulate, easier to control, and less likely to be missed if they disappeared. He was developing a predator's instincts, learning to identify the most vulnerable targets. His first known crimes were relatively minor: petty theft, fraud, small cons that allowed him to survive while moving from place to place. But even these early offenses showed signs of the calculating mind that would later orchestrate hundreds of murders. Luis was methodical in his planning, careful to avoid detection, and always thinking several steps ahead. During this period, Luis also began to develop the elaborate fantasy life that would sustain him through years of killing. He created multiple identities for himself, complete with backstories and documentation. He could be a teacher, a priest, a social worker, or a businessman, depending on what the situation required. This ability to reinvent himself would become crucial to his success as a serial killer. People who knew Luis during this time would later describe him as unremarkable, just another drifter trying to make his way in a difficult world. He was polite, quiet, and seemed to cause no trouble. No one suspected that behind his gentle demeanor, he was studying them, learning their weaknesses, and planning how he might use them. The voices that Luis claimed to hear were becoming more frequent and more specific. They told him that he had been chosen for a special purpose, that he was meant to cleanse the world of corruption and sin. In his twisted logic, the children he would eventually kill were not victims, but souls he was saving from the cruelty of the world. But beneath all the elaborate justifications and fantasies, the truth was simpler and more terrifying. Luis Garavito was discovering that he enjoyed having power over others, and children were the easiest targets for someone who wanted to experience absolute control over another human being. The transformation from petty criminal to serial killer was gradual, but by the early 1990s, Luis had crossed a line from which there would be no return. His first known murder occurred in 1992, though investigators believe he may have been killing for years before that, without anyone making the connection between the crimes. His method was always the same, refined through practice until it became a deadly routine. Luis would arrive in a new town and spend days or weeks observing, learning the local customs, identifying potential victims. He particularly targeted areas where street children congregated: markets, bus stations, parks where homeless kids might sleep. When he found a suitable victim, Luis would approach slowly, building trust over several encounters. He might offer food to a hungry child, or small gifts, or simply conversation to someone who was lonely and afraid. He presented himself as a teacher, a social worker, or sometimes a priest, always someone whose job it was to help children. The children who fell into his trap were among society's most vulnerable. Many were runaways fleeing abusive homes, orphans with no family to protect them, or kids whose families were so poor they spent their days on the streets trying to earn money. These children had learned to be suspicious of adults, but Luis was patient and skilled at overcoming their defenses. Once he had gained a child's trust, Luis would suggest a trip, perhaps to find work, or to visit a relative, or simply to go somewhere with better opportunities. The journey always led to an isolated area in the mountains or countryside, far from any help. There, the mask would finally come off, and the child would see Luis Garavito for what he truly was. What happened in those final moments was too horrible for most people to contemplate. Luis didn't just kill his victims, he tortured them, both physically and psychologically. He seemed to feed off their fear and pain, drawing out their suffering for as long as possible. When he was finally finished, he would bury the bodies in shallow graves, or leave them in remote areas where they might never be found. After each murder, Luis would move on to a new location, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles before selecting his next hunting ground. This nomadic lifestyle made it almost impossible for law enforcement to track him, especially since many of his victims were children whose disappearances weren't immediately reported or investigated. The scope of his crimes was becoming enormous, but because the murders were spread across different regions and jurisdictions, no one realized they were dealing with a single killer. Luis Garavito was becoming one of the most prolific serial killers in history, and he was just getting started. The impact of Luis Garavito's crimes extended far beyond the immediate horror of the murders themselves. Across Colombia, families were living in terror, afraid to let their children out of sight. Communities that had once been safe havens for kids became places of suspicion and fear, where every stranger was viewed as a potential threat. The families of Garavito's victims faced a unique kind of anguish. Many of them were poor, marginalized people who had little faith in the justice system to begin with. When their children disappeared, they often found that police were reluctant to investigate, dismissing the missing kids as runaways, or assuming they had simply moved on to another town. Maria Gonzalez lost her 8-year-old son, Pedro, in 1995. She spent months searching for him, walking from town to town, showing his picture to anyone who would look. The police told her that street children disappeared all the time, that Pedro had probably just found a better situation somewhere else. But Maria knew her son would never leave without telling her, and she never stopped looking. When Pedro's body was finally found 2 years later, Maria felt a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief because she finally knew what had happened to her child, and devastation because her worst fears had been confirmed. The discovery of Pedro's remains, along with those of dozens of other children, would eventually lead investigators to Luis Garavito. The media coverage of the disappearances was sporadic and often dismissive. Street children weren't considered newsworthy, and their deaths didn't generate the kind of public outrage that might have led to more intensive investigations. This societal indifference allowed Garavito to continue killing for years longer than he might have in a different context. Child welfare organizations tried to sound the alarm, but their warnings were largely ignored by authorities who were dealing with more immediate concerns like drug trafficking and political violence. Colombia in the 1990s was a country at war with itself, and the systematic murder of street children seemed like a minor problem compared to the larger conflicts tearing the nation apart. The psychological impact on surviving street children was enormous. They learned to trust no one, to sleep in groups for protection, and to run at the first sign of an adult showing unusual interest in them. An entire generation of vulnerable children was being traumatized by the knowledge that someone was hunting them. In the small towns where Garavito operated, parents began keeping their children inside after dark. Schools reported increased absenteeism as families became afraid to let their kids walk to class alone. The social fabric of these communities was being torn apart by fear and suspicion, but perhaps most tragically, the very poverty and marginalization that made these children vulnerable to Garavito in the first place also made it unlikely that their deaths would be properly investigated or their killer brought to justice. They were society's forgotten victims, and their disappearances barely registered in a country dealing with so many other forms of violence. The investigation that would eventually lead to Luis Garavito's capture began almost by accident. In 1997, a farmer in the town of Pereira discovered what appeared to be a mass grave containing the remains of several children. The local police initially assumed it was related to political violence, a common occurrence in Colombia at the time. But Detective Carlos Martinez, a veteran investigator with the National Police, noticed something different about these deaths. The children had been killed individually, not in a group execution. Their bodies showed signs of torture and sexual abuse. This wasn't political violence, it was something much more personal and disturbing. As Martinez began to investigate, he discovered that similar mass graves had been found in other parts of the country over the past several years. The pattern was always the same: children between the ages of 8 and 16, mostly boys, all showing signs of torture and sexual abuse. The killer was clearly moving from region to region, but no one had connected the dots. Working with investigators from other jurisdictions, Martinez began to map out what appeared to be the work of a single serial killer. The geographic spread was enormous. Graves had been found in over a dozen different states. The number of victims was staggering, far exceeding anything law enforcement had ever encountered. The breakthrough came when witnesses in several different towns provided similar descriptions of a man who had been seen with missing children shortly before they disappeared. He was small, soft-spoken, and often claimed to be a teacher or social worker. He carried gifts for children and seemed to have an unusual ability to gain their trust. Composite sketches were created and distributed, but the man's appearance was so unremarkable that dozens of false leads poured in. Luis Garavito's greatest strength as a predator, his ability to blend in and seem harmless, was also making him nearly impossible to catch. The investigation was complicated by jurisdictional issues, limited resources, and the fact that many of the victims had never been officially reported missing. Martinez found himself trying to solve hundreds of murders with minimal evidence and little support from a system that had never dealt with anything like this before. But gradually, the net was closing. Witnesses were providing more detailed descriptions, and investigators were beginning to understand the killer's methods and patterns. They knew he was still out there, still killing, and they were determined to stop him before he could claim any more victims. The challenge was enormous. How do you catch a ghost who can change his identity at will and whose victims are among society's most invisible members? But Detective Martinez and his team were committed to finding answers, not just for the sake of justice, but for the families who deserved to know what had happened to their children. The capture of Luis Garavito came not through brilliant detective work, but through a stroke of luck that finally put an end to his 7-year killing spree. On April 22, 1999, police in the town of Villavicencio arrested a man for attempting to rape a young boy. The suspect gave his name as Bonifacio Morera Lizcano and claimed to be a street vendor. But when investigators ran his fingerprints through their database, they discovered that Bonifacio was actually Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, and he matched the description of the man they had been hunting in connection with hundreds of child murders. The unassuming little man sitting in their jail cell was one of the most prolific serial killers in human history. Initially, Garavito denied everything. He maintained his false identity and claimed to know nothing about any murdered children. But as investigators presented him with evidence linking him to crime scenes across the country, his story began to fall apart. Faced with overwhelming proof of his guilt, he finally began to confess. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in criminal history. Over the course of several weeks, Garavito calmly described murder after murder, providing details that only the killer could know. He drew maps showing investigators where to find bodies, described his methods with clinical precision, and showed no emotion as he recounted the deaths of hundreds of children. The scope of his crimes was almost impossible to comprehend. Garavito confessed to killing over 400 children, though investigators believe the actual number may be even higher. He had been operating across multiple countries, not just Colombia, and had perfected his methods to the point where he could kill with virtual impunity. What was most disturbing about his confessions was not just the number of victims, but the casual way he described their deaths. Garavito spoke about murdering children the way someone else might describe their daily routine. There was no remorse, no recognition of the horror he had inflicted, no understanding that his victims had been human beings with hopes and dreams. He claimed that voices had told him to kill, that he was on a mission to cleanse the world of corruption. But investigators could see through these elaborate justifications to the truth underneath. Luis Garavito had killed because he enjoyed it, because it gave him a sense of power and control that he had never experienced in any other aspect of his life. The interrogation process was emotionally devastating for the investigators involved. Detective Martinez, who had spent years hunting this killer, found himself face to face with a monster who showed less emotion than most people display when discussing the weather. The contrast between Garavito's mild manner and the enormity of his crimes was almost impossible to process. As news of his arrest spread, families across Colombia finally began to get answers about their missing children. But for many, the knowledge of what had happened was almost worse than not knowing. The details of how their children had died were too horrible to bear. The courtroom where Luis Garavito faced trial was packed with family members of his victims, journalists and curious onlookers who wanted to see the face of evil for themselves. What they saw was profoundly disappointing. A small, unremarkable man who looked more like a retired clerk than history's most prolific serial killer. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Carmen Rodriguez, faced the challenge of presenting evidence for hundreds of murders while maintaining the jury's attention and emotional equilibrium. The scope of Garavito's crimes was so vast that it was difficult to comprehend as a single case rather than a natural disaster. Garavito's defense team, appointed by the court since he couldn't afford his own lawyers, attempted to argue that their client was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about his traumatic childhood, his claims of hearing voices, and his apparent disconnection from reality. But the prosecution's psychiatric experts painted a different picture. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic psychiatrist with decades of experience, testified that while Garavito certainly had psychological problems, he was not legally insane. His crimes showed too much planning, too much awareness of right and wrong, and too much effort to avoid detection for him to claim he didn't understand what he was doing. "This is not a man who lost touch with reality," Dr. Vasquez explained to the jury. "This is a man who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. His ability to maintain false identities, to plan his crimes carefully, and to avoid capture for years demonstrates that he was fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions." The most difficult part of the trial was listening to Garavito's own testimony. When he took the stand, he spoke in the same calm, soft voice that had once convinced hundreds of children to trust him. He showed no remorse for his victims, no understanding of the pain he had caused their families, no recognition that he had done anything wrong. When asked why he had killed so many children, Garavito gave rambling explanations about voices and missions and cleansing the world of sin. But underneath all the elaborate justifications, the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He had killed because he wanted to, because it made him feel powerful, and because he could. The families of his victims sat in the gallery, many of them seeing their children's killer for the first time. Some wept quietly as they listened to descriptions of how their sons and daughters had died. Others stared at Garavito with expressions of pure hatred, struggling to understand how someone who looked so harmless could have caused so much pain. The verdict was never in doubt. The evidence against Garavito was overwhelming, and his own confessions had sealed his fate. But the sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole in 22 years, seemed inadequate for someone who had taken so many lives. The psychological evaluation of Luis Garavito revealed a mind that was both fascinating and terrifying to mental health professionals. Dr. Patricia Morales, who spent months interviewing him after his conviction, found herself face to face with a level of evil that challenged her understanding of human psychology. What made Garavito particularly disturbing was not just the number of his victims, but the complete absence of normal human emotion in his personality. He could discuss the torture and murder of children with the same detachment that most people show when talking about the weather. There was no empathy, no remorse, no recognition that his victims had been human beings with their own hopes and fears. In 30 years of practice, I have never encountered anyone quite like Luis Garavito, Dr. Morales wrote in her report. He represents a complete absence of conscience, a mind that is capable of the most extreme cruelty without any emotional response whatsoever. He is, in the truest sense of the word, a monster. During their sessions, Garavito was cooperative and even friendly, answering questions with apparent honesty and showing genuine interest in the psychological evaluation process. But Dr. Morales quickly realized that his cooperation was just another form of manipulation. He was studying her reactions, trying to figure out what she wanted to hear and adjusting his responses accordingly. The most chilling aspect of Garavito's psychology was his complete inability to understand why his actions were wrong. He could recite moral principles and explain why murder was illegal, but he felt no emotional connection to these concepts. To him, killing children was simply something he enjoyed, like other people might enjoy music or sports. When Dr. Morales asked him about his victims, Garavito spoke about them as if they were objects rather than people. He remembered details about each murder with perfect clarity, but showed no emotional response to the memories. The children he had tortured and killed were, in his mind, simply tools he had used to satisfy his desires. Perhaps most disturbing was Garavito's view of himself as a victim. Despite having murdered hundreds of children, he genuinely believed that he was the one who had been wronged by life. His traumatic childhood, his poverty, his social isolation, these were the real tragedies in his mind. The children he had killed were barely worth considering. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a true predator, someone who had learned to navigate human society by mimicking its emotions while feeling none of them himself. Garavito had spent his entire adult life wearing a mask, presenting whatever version of himself would be most useful in any given situation. Dr. Morales concluded that there was no possibility of rehabilitation for someone like Garavito. His lack of empathy and remorse wasn't something that could be treated or cured. It was a fundamental part of who he was. He would always be a danger to children, and he would never feel genuine regret for what he had done. The case of Luis Garavito forces us to confront some of the most disturbing questions about human nature and society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. How could one man kill over 400 children without being stopped? What does his story tell us about the value we place on different types of lives? The most tragic aspect of Garavito's crimes is how preventable they were. His victims were street children, orphans, and kids from families so poor they had no voice in society. These children were invisible to the systems that should have protected them, and their disappearances barely registered in a country dealing with larger conflicts. If Garavito had been targeting middle-class children from stable families, he would have been caught much sooner. But because his victims were society's forgotten members, he was able to kill for years without anyone connecting the dots. This reveals an uncomfortable truth about how we value different lives and how some people are considered more disposable than others. The investigation that finally brought Garavito to justice was hampered by jurisdictional issues, limited resources, and a lack of coordination between different law enforcement agencies. But perhaps most significantly, it was hindered by a societal indifference to the fate of street children that allowed hundreds of murders to go unnoticed for years. Garavito's case also highlights the limitations of our criminal justice system when dealing with crimes of this magnitude. How do you punish someone who has taken 400 lives? How do you provide justice for families who will never see their children again? The sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole seems almost meaningless in the face of such enormous evil. Today, Luis Garavito remains in prison, now an old man whose killing days are behind him. He continues to maintain that he was on a divine mission, that the voices told him to cleanse the world of corruption. But the families of his victims know the truth, that their children died not for any grand purpose, but simply because a monster enjoyed killing them. His story serves as a reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary face, that the greatest dangers often come from those who seem the most harmless. It teaches us that we must be vigilant in protecting our most vulnerable members, and that we cannot allow poverty and marginalization to make some lives less valuable than others. The children who died at the hands of Luis Garavito will never grow up, never fulfill their dreams, never experience the love and happiness they deserved. Their deaths remind us that in a world where predators like Garavito exist, we all have a responsibility to watch over those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, the case of Luis Garavito is not just about one man's descent into evil. It's about a society's failure to protect its children and the terrible price that was paid for that failure. The beast that preyed on the innocent was able to hunt for so long because we, as a society, had already abandoned his victims long before he found them. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.